year was 1978. In Moscow, the Brezhnev-era zastoy, the stagnation, had settled over the city like a damp gray quilt. It was an era not of sharp terror, but of profound systemic inertia. The Soviet Union was a superpower resting on a foundation of paperwork, a colossal bureaucracy where procedure had replaced ideology as the true faith. Within this leviathan, the Komitet Gosударственной Безопасности, the KGB, was its own universe, a state within a state, headquartered at Dzerzhinsky Square, the infamous Lubyanka. But the true work of the state was not always done in the imposing main offices. It was done in the annexes, the basements, and the forgotten sub-departments that spiderwebbed beneath the capital. Lyudmila Ivanovna Petrova was a cog in this machine, and she was, by all measures, a model cog. At 47, she was a creature of absolute routine, unmarried, living in a small but clean apartment 2 blocks from the Prospect Mira metro station. Her life was defined by its quiet order. She was not a dissident nor a true believer. She was simply an archivist. She worked in the 9th section of the 5th Chief Directorate, the division tasked with monitoring and countering ideological subversion. Her specific role, however, was far removed from the dramatic work of internal surveillance. She was assigned to the Central Reference Archive, a vast climate-controlled repository that held the paper ghosts of the Soviet past. Her domain was sub-basement 4G, a cavernous room smelling of aging paper, ferrous dust, and the faint, sharp odor of floor wax. Here, rows of dark green metal shelving stretched into the gloom, holding millions of buff-colored manila folders, each tied with a precise string knot. Lyudmila was a chronitel, a keeper. Her loyalty was not to the personalities of the Politburo, which changed, but to the files, which were permanent. She believed in the system because the system was predictable. A request form, correctly stamped, yielded a file. A file, correctly logged, was returned to its space. This was the mechanism of Gosudarstvenost, of statehood. Her immediate supervisor was Comrade Anton Kurchin, a man who reflected the era perfectly. He was heavy-set, breathing audibly, his desk perpetually cluttered with tea glasses and reports he had no intention of reading. Kurchin's primary concern was ensuring their section met its quarterly quotas for file processing, a metric that ensured their department's budget, and, more importantly, his own small privileges, access to a better poliklinika and the occasional talon voucher for deficit goods. He regarded Lyudmila with the lazy confidence of a bureaucrat who knows his subordinate is too meticulous to ever cause trouble. Lyudmila's work was her identity. She arrived at 7:52 a.m. She took her lunch, black bread, a hard-boiled egg, at her desk at 12:30 p.m. She left at 5:01 p.m. She understood the unspoken rules. One did not ask questions about the content of the files, only their location. One did not speculate. One did not exhibit lyubopitstvo, curiosity. Curiosity was a procedural deviation, and in the 5th Directorate, procedural deviations were filed, noted, and remembered. Lyudmila Petrova had a perfect record. She was trusted, which, in the Soviet system, meant she was predictable enough to be ignored. In the spring of 1979, a directive arrived from the 12th Directorate, the department responsible for technology and, fatefully, electronic records. It was titled, On the Optimization of State Archival Resources. The stagnation was breeding inefficiency, and even the KGB felt the strain. The solution was a massive, clumsy modernization project, the Velikaya Konsolidatsiya, or Great Consolidation. The plan was to cross-reference millions of paper files from the 1950s and 1960s, the turbulent years after Stalin's passing and the Khrushchev era, with the new, primitive mainframe database. Lyudmila was assigned to the most tedious part of this project, manual verification. Her task was to take stacks of personnel files from the deep archive, many marked with the ink of the precursor MGB, and compare their summary sheets with new punch card printouts. It was mind-numbing work. The printouts were often faint, the paper files brittle. But Lyudmila, as always, was thorough. It was during this process that the first early signs emerged, small fractures in the concrete of the state's memory. She found a file for a junior political officer listed as transferred to the Far East Military District in 1961. yet his internal passport number was identical to that of a man listed as removed from service in 1959. A simple typographical error, she assumed. She filled out a Form 39B, record discrepancy, as procedure demanded. A week later, she found another. A file for a translator marked liquidated 1953 had a pay disbursement slip attached dated 1955. She noted the error. Comrade Kirchin called her into his office. He did not look at her. He tapped his pen on the Form 39B she had submitted. Lyudmila Ivanovna. He sighed, the vapor of his cheap cigarettes washing over her. This is zealous work. Excellent. However, the directive is for consolidation, not correction. But Anton Borisovich, the records are incorrect. The numbers do not align. Kirchin finally met her gaze. His eyes were dull, but carried a warning. The purpose of the consolidation is to confirm that the paper record matches the electronic record. If the new record is flawed, you correct the new record. If the old record is flawed. He shrugged. We are not historians, Lyudmila Ivanovna. We are administrators. The 1950s were a complicated time. The party has already established the correct historical narrative. Our job is to ensure our archives reflect that narrative. Do you understand? Fix the printout to match the file, stamp it, and move on. We have a quota. She understood perfectly. The truth was not the goal. The goal was consensus. The Bumaznaya realnost, the paper reality, was what mattered. She returned to her desk, her sense of order slightly disturbed. Kirchin was telling her to ignore the anomalies. For the good of the system, for the sake of the quota, she was to perpetuate the mistakes. This, more than any secret, felt wrong. It was poor administration. The discovery occurred on a Tuesday in October. The air in sub-basement 4G was unusually cold. The heating pipes were rattling but produced no warmth. Lyudmila was working on a batch of files from the First Chief Directorate, Foreign Intelligence, temporarily housed in their archive due to renovations. These files were different. Higher quality paper, cleaner type, a different classification stamp. Her task was the same, cross-reference. She pulled File 81B. Subject, Agent Pavel, Kuznetsov Dmitry. Active 1955-1975. A decorated agent, having served in Helsinki and Bonn. Awarded the Order of the Red Banner. Retired with full honors. Pension active, a model file. She logged it. Next, she requested File 904G from the 1950s Domestic Registry. This file was older, the folder soft at the edges. Subject, Ivan, Gorshkov, Semyon. Status, expelled from the party, 1954. Charged with ideological deviation and anti-Soviet conduct. The final entry, stamped in purple ink, read, Case closed, subject removed from roster, file to dead archive. This was a traitor's file. Lyudmila was simply matching inventory numbers, but as she prepared to close 904G, the attached photograph, a black and white high-contrast mugshot, caused her to pause. Her blood ran colder than the room. She rolled her chair back to the cart and pulled File 81B, Pavel, the hero. She laid them side by side under her desk lamp. It was the same man. It was not a resemblance. It was identical. The shape of the eyes. A small pale scar above the left eyebrow. The distinct structure of the earlobe. Pavel, the hero retired in 1975, was Ivan, the traitor removed in 1954. Lyudmila froze. This was not a typographical error. This was not a misplaced payslip. This was an impossibility. A man could not be both a decorated hero and an expunged traitor. The state had declared him non-existent in 1954, yet had employed and decorated him under a new name starting in 1955. Her training told her to close the files and walk away. Her meticulously ordered mind, however, saw only the contradiction. This was a violation of the fundamental laws of the archive. A file could not be two things. Driven by a cold, analytical compulsion, she did something she had never done. She deviated. She accessed the internal pension ledger, a restricted access logbook she only had clearance for because of the consolidation project. She looked up Pavel. His pension was active, paid monthly to a Moscow address. Then, trembling almost imperceptibly, she looked up Ivan. The file was closed. The man was gone. But the ledger told a different story. Ivan, the traitor, was also receiving payments. They were smaller, routed through a complex internal account designated Special Reserve 4, a black fund. The implications flooded her. The system was not just flawed, it was actively maintaining a dual reality. It was running a black book operation, keeping traitors on a hidden payroll. She had not found a mistake. She had found a mechanism. She had found an entire parallel archive. Lyudmila Petrova did not sleep that night. She sat in her small kitchen, the silence of her apartment amplifying the frantic, logical ticking of her mind. She was not afraid for her life. She was afraid of the disorder. The system was fundamentally dishonest, not just in its propaganda, but in its own internal mechanics. She, a mere archivist, was not equipped to handle this. Her instinct was to report it. The system must have a way to correct such a profound error. The next morning she approached Comrade Kirchin's office. She did not mention the photographs. She focused on the only thing she could legitimately report, the accounting. "Anton Borisovich," she said, her voice strained but formal. "While conducting the consolidation, I found a significant financial anomaly. A payment ledger from Special Reserve 4 is making disbursements to an individual, Semyon Gorshkov, who was officially removed from service in 1954. It appears to be a major accounting error." Kirchin, who had been stirring his tea, stopped. He did not look up. He stared at the vortex in his glass. For a full 30 seconds, the only sound was the scrape of the metal spoon as he slowly resumed stirring. "Lyudmila Ivanovna," he said, his voice terrifyingly soft. "You are mistaken. You must have misread the file number. I checked it twice, Anton Borisovich, file 904G. There is no such disbursement," Kirchin said, his voice flat. "You are overworked. The consolidation is stressful. Go home for the day. Take a rest." "But the ledger—" "Go home." She left. When she returned the next morning, her access key to the building worked, but Comrade Kirchin's office was empty. The nameplate was gone. An inquiry to the section secretary was met with a blank stare. Comrade Kirchin was transferred, Lyudmila Ivanovna, to the Ural's office. It was very sudden. An hour later, her new supervisor arrived. He was not a bureaucrat like Kirchin. He introduced himself as Major Viktor Morozov. He was thin, elegant, and wore the uniform of the 1st Chief Directorate, not their own 5th. He had pale blue eyes and a grip that was dry and firm. He didn't move into Kirchin's office. He simply took a desk in the main archive room, among the clerks. "A pleasure to assist with the consolidation," he said, his smile never reaching his eyes. "I am here to ensure procedural integrity." The surveillance began immediately. It was not overt. It was systemic. Lyudmila's work assignments were changed. She was taken off the consolidation project. She was reassigned to cataloging pre-revolutionary property deeds. It was pointless, safe work. Morozov watched her. He was always present, always polite. He would sometimes stop by her desk. "Is the work satisfactory, Lyudmila Ivanovna? You seem tense. The health of our cadres is paramount." He was not inquiring. He was logging her state. Her colleagues became distant. Conversation stopped when she approached the break room. She was being isolated, turned into an object of suspicion. The apparat was observing her, testing her, waiting to see what she would do with the knowledge she possessed. She realized, with a chilling certainty, that Kirchin's transfer was a consequence of her report. She had reported an anomaly, and the system had removed the man she reported it to. For 2 months, Lyudmila existed in this state of quiet quarantine. She did her new, meaningless work with the same meticulous care as before. She spoke to no one. She went home. She read. She tried to erase the memory of file 904G and file 81B. She tried to convince herself she had been overworked, that she had imagined the identical photographs. The system wanted her to believe it, and belief was the path of least resistance. She was terrified, but her terror manifested as an almost painful rigidity. The confrontation, when it came, was as quiet and bureaucratic as everything else. Major Morozov approached her desk on a Friday afternoon. "Lyudmila Ivanovna, a small administrative task, if you please," he said smoothly. We have a request for file 904G, the 1954 Gorshkov file. It is still logged under your name from your consolidation work. Please retrieve it from the deep archive and bring it to my desk for countersignature and transfer. This was not a request. It was a test, a demand. Her hands were steady, but her pulse was a drum against her ribs. She walked the familiar path into sub-basement 4G. The smell of dust and old glue. She found the shelf. She pulled the file. She paused, alone in the narrow aisle. She had to know. She had to know if she was losing her mind, or if the system was truly what she feared it was. Her hands, violating every rule she had ever lived by, untied the string. She opened the file. The confrontation was not with Morozov. It was with the file itself. The photograph of Ivan Semyon Gorshkov was still there, but it was not the same photograph. This man was similar, same age, same dark hair, but the eyes were different. The scar was absent. The earlobe was rounded. It was a completely different person. She flipped back to the charge sheet. The purple ink stamp, removed from roster, was there, but the document felt new. The paper was stiffer. The type impression was sharper than she remembered. The system had reached back in time. It had altered its own memory. They knew she had seen it. They had surgically replaced the evidence, creating a new, correct version of the past. The file she now held in her hands declared her own memory to be false. She had seen the impossible, and now the impossible had been tidied up. She stood there for a long time. She felt a profound sense of vertigo, as if the very floor of the archive had dropped away. This was the true power. Not force, but the power to rewrite reality, to make a fact an unfact. She tied the file, her fingers moving with their old precision. She walked back out to the main room and placed the folder on Morozov's desk. He did not look up from his writing. "Thank you, Lyudmila Ivanovna." He knew what she had just seen. She knew that he knew, and he knew that she would say nothing. The confrontation was over. The system had won. Lyudmila believed the test was over. She had seen the altered file. She had remained silent. She had proven her compliance. She assumed she would be left alone, a neutralized component, to finish her days cataloging textile patterns or pre-revolutionary deeds. She had underestimated the system's pathological need for absolute closure. Her exposure, it was not a public arrest, not a dramatic denunciation, happened 3 days later. It was a Monday. She arrived at the checkpoint at 7:51 a.m. as always. She presented her internal pass to the guard, a young man named Boris she had nodded to every day for 5 years. He did not nod back. He checked her photograph, then looked at a list on a clipboard. He looked back at her, his expression neutral, his eyes carefully avoiding hers. "Your presence is requested, Lyudmila Ivanovna." He did not buzz her through the turnstile. Instead, a side door opened, and 2 men in plain, ill-fitting suits emerged. They were not from her directorate. They were Pervy Odell, the First Department, the internal affairs representatives who existed in every major Soviet enterprise. "Please come with us," one of them said. It was not a request. She was not handcuffed. She was not marched. She was escorted politely as if she were a visiting dignitary. They did not take her to the Lubyanka's infamous cells. They took her up to the administrative wing, to a long carpeted corridor she had never seen. They showed her into a room that looked like a dentist's waiting area, furnished with heavy, dark wood chairs. She sat for 4 hours. No one spoke to her. No one offered her water. There was no clock. This was the first stage, the disorientation of bureaucracy. Finally, the door opened. Major Morozov entered. He was not in uniform. He wore a sharp civilian suit. He carried a single thin folder. "Lyudmila Ivanovna," he said, sitting opposite her. His tone was not unkind. It was analytical, as if she were a mathematical problem he had been tasked to solve. "We have a problem. A matter of state security." I do not understand, Major." "It has come to our attention," Morozov continued, opening the folder, "that significant procedural violations have occurred in the Central Reference Archive, specifically related to the Consolidation Project." He was not accusing her of treason. He was not accusing her of espionage. He was accusing her of bad paperwork. In the USSR, this was perhaps more serious. "You filed a query regarding file 904G, he stated. Yes, I believed it was an accounting error. I reported it to Comrade Kirchen. Comrade Kirchen has been reassigned due to his own administrative failures," Morozov said coldly. "But the query originated with you. You accessed files outside the immediate parameters of your work order. You cross-referenced material from different directorates. This," he tapped the paper, "is your original discrepancy form, Form 39B. She had been trapped by her own meticulousness. Her attempt to correct the system was the very evidence being used against her. This form," Morozov said, "suggests one of two things. 1. You are incompetent, unable to read a simple ledger. 2. You were curious." He let the word hang in the air. Lyubopitstvo, the cardinal sin. Curiosity, Lyudmila Ivanovna, implies a lack of faith. It implies you believe the party's records are flawed and that you, a junior archivist, have the authority to correct them. This is a form of ideological arrogance. It is a procedural nihilism that cannot be tolerated. She was not a traitor. She was a procedural nihilist. The exposure was complete. She was not an enemy of the state. She was an error in the system, and the system above all else corrected its errors. The interrogation was not one event, but a series of conversations that stretched over 2 weeks. Lyudmila was not held in a cell. She was placed in administrative isolation in a sanatorium outside Moscow, a facility normally used for high-level party members to recover from exhaustion. It was comfortable, clean, and utterly terrifying. There were no locks on her door, but she knew, intrinsically, she could not leave. Morozov was her only visitor. He came every afternoon at 4 p.m., always bringing a file. The conversations were calm, academic, and designed to dismantle her reality. There was no physical pressure. The entire process was psychological. It was Zersetzung, the disintegration of the self. "Let us review." He would begin, opening a file. "You claim the photograph in 904G was identical to 81B. It was, I am certain. Here is 904G. Here is 81B. He produced the new altered files. "They are clearly different men, are they not? Look. They are different now. The file was... it was changed." Morozov would sigh, a theatrical display of disappointment. "Lyudmila Ivanovna, you are alleging a conspiracy. You are alleging that officers of the First Chief Directorate are engaged in theatricals, forging documents. Why? To confuse you? A clerk? Does that sound logical?" He painted her as arrogant. He suggested she was delusional. "Let us consider another possibility," he'd say, leaning forward. "The consolidation project. The hours are long. The air quality in sub-basement 4G is poor. The light is artificial. You are a meticulous woman. Perhaps too meticulous. You wanted to find an error. Your mind, under stress, created one. A simple case of cognitive transference. He was giving her an escape. He was offering her the out of madness. "No," she insisted, her voice small. "I saw what I saw. This was the wrong answer." Morozov's demeanor hardened. The next day, the topic changed. "We have reviewed your work logs for the past year," he said. "On 3 separate occasions, you corrected department logs with red ink when the procedural manual clearly states black ink. On August 14th, you failed to file a Form 12 transfer slip for a restricted file until the next business day, a clear violation of Guideline 22A. He listed a dozen tiny bureaucratic infractions. Separately, they were nothing. Together, they painted a portrait of a person who held contempt for the rules. "This is a pattern, Lyudmila Ivanovna," he said, his voice flat. "A pattern of deviation. It starts with red ink. It ends with questioning state records. It is the same ideological disease. You believe you are above the apparat." By the end of the 2nd week, she was exhausted. Her own memory felt like a fragile piece of glass. He had isolated her and defined her as an anomaly. The only way back to reality, the only way out of the sanatorium, was to accept his version of events. I must have been mistaken," she finally whispered, staring at the bland carpet. "The stress. I imagined the similarity in the photographs." Morozov smiled. It was the first genuine expression she had ever seen from him. It was the smile of a craftsman finishing a project. "Excellent," he said. He produced a typed document. It was a confession, not of treason, but of procedural failures stemming from nervous exhaustion and ideological confusion. It stated that she had fabricated the discrepancy. She signed it. The interrogation was over. Lyudmila Petrova was not sent to a camp. She was not declared an enemy of the people. The system had no interest in making her a martyr or an object of curiosity. The goal was neutralization, and the most effective neutralization was bureaucratic oblivion. She was released from the sanatorium. Her case was closed. The official finding was ideological confusion due to overwork, and she was granted a medical transfer. She was permanently reassigned from the 5th Chief Directorate. Her career in state security, the only life she had ever known, was over. Her new job was at the Ministry of Light Industry, in a gray building on the opposite side of Moscow. She was assigned to their internal archive. Her new task was to catalog textile patterns and import-export manifests for footwear. It was a professional graveyard. The work was simple, the stakes non-existent. She was, in effect, a non-person. The true aftermath was the isolation. It was subtle, but absolute. Her former colleagues from the 5th Directorate, the women she had shared tea with for 15 years, no longer saw her. If she encountered one on the street, they would suddenly find something fascinating in a shop window or cross the road to avoid contact. The pervy Adel, First Department representative at the Ministry of Light Industry, paid her a visit on her first day, a welcome that served as a clear reminder. She was being watched. She lived her life in the same apartment. She took the same metro line, just in a different direction, but she was hollowed out. The system had not broken her. It had edited her. She had been a component with a purpose, to maintain the records. Now she was a discarded part. The greatest consequence, however, was internal. Lyudmila, the woman who believed in order above all, now existed with the agonizing knowledge that the entire system was built on a foundation of meticulously managed lies. She knew that Pavel, the hero, and Ivan, the traitor, were the same man, and that the state had mobilized its immense power to deny this simple fact. She alone possessed this truth, and the truth was useless. It was a piece of data that could not be filed, logged, or spoken. It was the ultimate disorder, and she was forced to carry it, silently, for the rest of her life. The legacy of Lyudmila's discovery was not her own demotion, but the monumental secret convulsion she had caused within the KGB. Major Morozov was not merely testing her, he was containing a breach. Lyudmila, a low-level clerk, had accidentally stumbled upon the system's deepest and most sensitive secret, Operation Tuman, Operation Fog. This was not just a single black book agent. Tuman was an entire ghost network, established in the chaotic 1950s, of agents who had been officially purged, liquidated, or imprisoned. These individuals, now officially non-existent, were the perfect deep-cover assets. They were used for the most sensitive domestic operations, acting as provocateurs within dissident groups or as illegal agents within the Soviet Union itself. Their handlers were few, and their existence was known only to the very highest echelons of the First Chief Directorate. Lyudmila's Form 39B, her simple accounting query, had sent a shockwave through the apparat. It proved that the Tuman network was vulnerable. It was vulnerable to the one thing the KGB could not fully control, its own bureaucracy. A meticulous clerk, doing her job too well, could unravel the entire program through a simple cross-reference. Morozov was promoted to colonel for his handling of the Petrova case. But his real task was far larger. He was put in charge of Project Labyrinth, a 3-year, top-secret initiative. The goal: to erase Operation Tuman from the archives themselves. Starting in 1980, Morozov's team began the Great Erasure. It was the dark twin of the Great Consolidation. They did not burn the archives. They sanitized them. They went through millions of files, not with computers, but by hand. They located every file connected to Tuman. They physically removed the original documents, the photos, the charge sheets, the payment ledgers. They replaced them with expertly crafted forgeries, just as they had done with File 904G. They created new, plausible histories for every ghost. Ivan was now, and had always been, a different person. The contradictory pension payments were erased from the ledgers. By 1983, Operation Tuman no longer existed in the state's memory. The real files were incinerated, their ashes scattered. The secret archive was gone. The only proof that remained was locked inside the silent, cataloging mind of Lyudmila Petrova. Her accidental discovery had forced the USSR to purge its own deepest secrets, not to hide them from the West, but to hide them from itself, from its own internal logic. Moscow, 1992. The Soviet Union was gone. The red flag had been lowered from the Kremlin. A new, chaotic Russia was born, and with it, a hunger for the past. Journalists and historians, emboldened by glasnost and the collapse of the party, flooded the newly opened KGB archives. They were looking for the truth, for the mechanisms of the state. They found records of repression, of camps, of surveillance, but they found no trace of Operation Tuman. The erasure, Project Labyrinth, had been a complete success. The historians found the file for Ivan Gorshkov Semyon and saw a simple 1954 traitor. They found the file for Pavel Kuznetsov Dmitry and saw a decorated hero. The records were clean. The paper reality was seamless. Lyudmila Ivanovna Petrova was still alive. She was an elderly pensioner living in the same apartment. A young researcher tracking former employees of the 5th Directorate even interviewed her. He found a polite, quiet old woman who remembered very little. She spoke only of the tedium of the work, the smell of the dust, and the quotas. She said nothing of the photographs. To speak of it now, even in this new world, would be to admit that her entire life's work was a lie, and that she herself was a procedural nihilist. The truth had been isolated within her for so long that it had become part of her, indistinct from her own being. The ultimate reflection on this case is not one of drama, but of process. The true power of the apparat was not its capacity for force, which was considerable, but its absolute control over the narrative. The system did not just silence its critics, it erased the reason for their criticism. Lyudmila's tragedy was not her demotion to the Ministry of Light Industry. Her tragedy was that she, alone, became the last archive. She was the one file 904G that Morozov could not alter, a living record of a truth that the state had declared non-existent. The archives were erased, but the memory, held by one woman, remained, silent and irrelevant, a final, unfiled data point in a system that had ceased to exist.